Hey Lake Point, Pastor Michael here to get you caught up on the first week of our series, Thriving in Babylon, a series in which we're pulling lessons from the life of Daniel. Now, the nation of Babylon is used all throughout Scripture as an archetype of society that lives in rebellion against God. It represents a culture that values pride, power, prestige, and pleasure. From the Tower of Babel in the book of Genesis to the final act of God's justice in the book of Revelation, the biblical authors use Babylon to symbolize the human pursuit of progress without the presence of God. For example, the Apostle Peter in his letters to the Christians scattered abroad, or the Apostle John in his apocalyptic vision in the book of Revelation, liken imperial Rome to that of Babylon. And as Pastor Nathan shared, if Peter and John were writing to the church in North America today, there's little doubt they would liken our modern day Canadian culture to that of Babylon. You see, over the years, Christianity in Canada has shifted from a majority to a minority. Only 23% of Canadians attend religious services of any kind. And what's more, Christianity has shifted from the center to the fringe. There was a time when Christians were at the center of cultural influence. Most government leaders were Christian, or at least held to Judeo-Christian worldviews. Most universities were started by Christians, and pastors and clergy were considered people of high standing. Not so much anymore. Christianity has moved from the center of influence and power to the fringe. What we're also seeing is that Christianity has moved from being well respected to somewhat disrespected. A recent Barna research group polls reported that the two divine characteristics of Christians in terms of cultural perception are irrelevant and extreme, aka Christians are perceived as either out of touch or out of balance. And so, how did we get there? Well, three things played a major role. First, secularization. 500 years ago, it was almost unthinkable in Western culture not to believe in God, and specifically not to believe in Jesus. Now it's just normal. Even for the most devoted followers of Jesus, they often entertain skepticism and uncertainty. The second causation is affluence. The post-World War II economic boom brought with it the rise of the middle class. People now had more money, and with it, more options. And among those options were what the New Testament would call worldly pleasures. It gave people less of a felt need for God, and so consumerism and an unending supply of material possessions have effectively killed a spiritual hunger and thirst in our culture. The third and the biggest factor is multiculturalism. Now, that's not a political statement, it's just a historic one. There was a huge change in immigration before and after World War II. Prior to World War II, most immigrants came from Western Europe. Post-World War II, most immigrants now come from Southeast Asia, the Middle East, India, South America, and others. And so, for the first time in Canadian history, a Hindu or a Buddhist or a Muslim or a Sikh was no longer a character in a book that you read about from far away. It was now your classmate or your neighbor or even your colleague. And so this dramatically changed the Canadian landscape. Now, that's not a bad thing. God said to bring the gospel to every nation and tribe, and that used to mean having to get on a boat and sailing halfway across the world. Now, in most Canadian cities, it simply means going across the street. Globalization has never made evangelism more easy to do. Multiculturalism isn't a bad thing. It simply dramatically changed the spiritual topography of Canada. And those three factors, secularization, affluence, and multiculturalism, have led to a post-Christian society, which in many ways feels like a foreign country to those of you who grew up in the nation 50 years ago. David Kinnaman, in his book Faith for Exiles, contrasts these two realities by comparing former Canadian culture to that of ancient Jerusalem and comparing present-day Canadian culture to that of ancient Babylon. He explains how 50 years ago, many people experienced a culture that was very Jerusalem-like. There's monotheistic Judeo-Christian faith. It was the prevailing religion of the majority of people, and they were white, middle-class Canadians who unashamedly claimed to rely on the Bible for authority. The pace of change was comparatively slow, so there was greater continuity between general knowledge and experience, and most everyone seemed to agree on what life was about. And in that sense, things felt sweet, simple, and straightforward. Nowadays, however, the Bible is one of many voices to interpret human experience, and it's no longer viewed as the central authority over people and culture. We now live in a pluralistic society that moves at a frenetic pace that is diverse and complex. In many ways, it's reflective of ancient Babylon. Babylon was the pagan but spiritual, hyper-stimulated, multicultural, imperial crossroads of the ancient world that became the unwilling home of Jewish exiles. If you're familiar with the story, you know that in the 6th century before Christ, Babylon invaded Judah and took 10,000 of their most elite citizens prisoner. These exiles, including Daniel and his 3 friends, were deported to Babylon. Daniel was most likely between the ages of 13 and 17 when this happened. He would spend the rest of his life in this foreign culture, far from his home, kidnapped from his family, immersed in a godless society, serving this evil, sadistic king. Yet Daniel didn't give up or give in. He settled down in his new home in Babylon, and he made the best of it. And in doing so, he provides for us a template for how we can do the same. The point of the book of Daniel is to explore what it means to be a minority living in a majority culture that is disinterested and at times even hostile to your way of life. The story of Daniel teaches us not only how to be resilient followers of Jesus, where we resist conforming to our dominant culture, but beyond that, it teaches us how to influence our host culture and work towards its renewal. Now, Pastor Nate didn't jump into Daniel's story this week, but he did prime us for it by sharing about 2 postures to avoid when we find ourselves living in exile. And the first one is this: separatism. It's a turtle position. It's where we kind of tuck our heads into our shell, close our eyes, and we wait till the big bad world goes away. And one of the major problems with separatism is that it tends to lead to legalism. And people who grow up in a legalistic Christian environment usually end up throwing the baby out with the bathwater and want nothing to do with Jesus or the church or faith. And that's tragic. The other posture to avoid when it comes to living in exile is syncretism. And this is the chameleon posture where you just blend in and eventually look no different than the culture around you. And syncretism leads to liberalism, where eventually anything goes. The majority of Christians succumb to the temptations of either separatism or syncretism. But there's a better way, and that is to become a creative minority. John Tyson, an Australian pastor in New York City, he defines a creative minority this way. He says, a creative minority is a Christian community in a web of stubbornly loyal relationships knotted together in a living network of persons who are committed to practicing the way of Jesus together for the renewal of the world. John Tyson is calling us to have a vision for Christianity, not based on fear of a godless future or the longing for this idealized past, but becoming a beautiful presence in society that leads to the transformation of culture itself. However, becoming a creative minority is not easy because it involves maintaining strong links with the outside world while staying true to our faith. And the dual focus of being both faithful and fruitful is not an easy tension to live in. But it's this beautiful picture of what the church is called to do in these challenging times where we seek neither to control nor abandon the world, but rather to love it to its new life. We see this illustrated throughout the life of Daniel. And did you know that the book of Jeremiah is a letter written by the prophet from Jerusalem to the first waves of exiles living in Babylon, meaning that Daniel and his friends would have been the ones who received it? Well, in it, Jeremiah writes this. In chapter 29, verse 4, we read that, "This is what the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, says to all those I carried into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon. Build houses and settle down, plant gardens and eat what they produce. Marry and have sons and daughters, find wives for your sons and give your daughters in marriage, so that they too may have sons and daughters. Increase in number there, do not decrease. Seek the peace and prosperity of the city to which I have carried you into exile. Pray to the Lord for it, because if it prospers, you too will prosper." What is God's message to Daniel and those living in exile? He's saying, be prepared to stay a while, settle down, build houses, plant gardens, make this your home. He's saying, keep your identity, keep your community intact by having lots of babies. Don't forget where you came from and who you are. And he's saying, pray for the peace and the prosperity of the city. Which is crazy, because remember, this is the city that is the personification of evil all throughout Scripture. This is the city that is spiritually hostile to their faith. This is the city that has kidnapped them from their home, dragged them hundreds of miles away from their family, and is seeking to indoctrinate them in their occult practices. And they're supposed to pray for the peace and the prosperity of the city? Like, why is that? It's because God cares about the welfare of humanity. The word peace in Hebrew is the word shalom, and has a far richer meaning than the English word peace, which simply means inner tranquility. Shalom means to experience life the way God intended it, where we are reconciled with God, each other, and the rest of creation, where the whole world is in harmony, where societies and humanity flourish. This is God's ultimate goal for our world, and this is what He calls us to devote our lives to as Christians. It's why in our post-Christian culture, God is looking to raise up a creative minority, a group of Christ followers who won't just survive, but they'll actually thrive in exile. A group of Christ followers who will not just hold on to their beliefs, but simultaneously influence and transform the culture around them. Well, friends, thanks for listening. Enjoy jumping into discussion questions. I'll see you next time.